Topic 5, Political Structures and Institutions. Since these notes are very much a review of the concepts that we went over in United States government and politics, you do not need to write the notes word for word. Instead, listen to the notes and then use what you hear as a way to complete the charts and discussion questions that I gave you on the guided notes worksheets. Okay, levels of government. So under levels of government, you will see that you need to provide a description of unitary, federalism, and confederation. All right, so for unitary, remember it is policy-making powers are concentrated in a capital city or in one place. The central government is responsible for most of the policy decisions, and most of the countries throughout the world have a unitary system. Federal system, what we have here in the United States, so power is divided between a national or central government or federal government, like in DC. And then you have subunits, and in the United States, we have the different state governments, and each state has a governor, a legislative branch, they hold elections, they have reserved powers as prescribed in the 10th Amendment. Regional bodies will be able to do things like tax, make laws, enforce laws, establish courts, so on and so forth. Okay. Of the AP6, Mexico, Nigeria have federal systems, and then Russia has a asymmetrical federal system. Confederal, none of the countries that we study, or none of the states that we study have these. We do study the EU, and when we go over the EU, that would be a confederal system because there's power spread amongst the subunits or the different states that are a part of the EU. Of course, under the Articles of Confederation, the United States was operating under a confederal system where you had a weak central government. Now, we're going to introduce one type of level to this, and that's going to be supranational governments or organizations. So this is where you have an organization that has power and authority over the member states that belong to the organization. Member states are encouraged to give up some of their sovereignty and decision making to become a part of the organization, but in return, that state would become more politically, militarily, or economically powerful. So the members of NATO all agree to give up some of their military decision-making power to become part of NATO, which is a military alliance. NAFTA, Canada, the United States, Mexico have agreed to forego some of their control over tariffs and restrictions of trade between the three countries in order to become an economic powerhouse. And then, of course, the EU, where the member states of the EU have agreed to give some decision-making authority to the governing body of the EU. You're going to see more supranational organizations pop up since the increase of globalization or interconnectedness of all of the states. Okay, advantages of the federal system. And we've talked about the advantages in U.S. government, like being able to use the states as laboratories, testing out policy at the state level before you implement it at the national level. It also makes it easier to govern a large country with a bunch of different regional differences. So that's how it works so well here in the United States, because California can make laws that best suit Californians. Iowa can make laws that best suit Iowans, so on and so forth. Ironically, though, the largest countries, like China, largest countries tend to have federal governments, except for China. Even though China is geographically large and it has such a large population, it still has a unitary government, partly because it wants to concentrate power amongst the Communist Party. Okay, so better accommodate regional differences. And it's a check. I mean, it's one of the principles of the Constitution in order to check tyranny at the national level. Okay. However, you do have some advantages of having a unitarian system or a unitary system. There is no question or conflict about who is in control, or there's no question or conflict about, is this an overreach of federal government power over the states. Well, if there's no state power, then you can't question that. There's no conflicts with unfunded mandates or anything like that. There's no question about who gets to vote per state. What do you need to take to the voting booth? Right, none of that. And unitary governments are in a better position to redistribute resources. So where we have unequal distribution of resources, like I've talked about before, that Mississippi doesn't have the same level of services or income from personal property tax as Massachusetts. So it's going to be an unequal distribution of resources and unequal distribution of services and so forth and so on. You don't have to worry about that so much in a unitary system. And if you have a unitary system, that can be the bridge that overcomes cleavages, social cleavages. So if there's a deep social division, especially regional social division, if you have one level of government, they can kind of bring all of the different regional differences together and overcome those issues. Whereas in federalism, regional differences can be exacerbated if you give separate subunits or regional governments some power. Okay. Devolution. We learned about the devolution of power in U.S. government is when the federal government gives some power to the states. Okay. And that can happen in AP government, AP comparative. We're going to look at how leaders of unitary systems will actually devolve power to regional governments in order to make the people of those regions happy. Now we see this in the UK. So Parliament has agreed to give some power to the Scottish parliaments and to Northern Ireland to keep them from wanting to break off completely. Even though we have seen a referendum or a vote in Scotland to become independent, which that referendum was not successful, partly because about 55% of the people in Scotland, or 55% of the voters in Scotland, felt that being able to have regional autonomy to a sense was good enough. But not breaking off completely, and especially economically from the UK, that they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to be that devolved or independent. Okay, so why would a unitary government devolve power to regional governments? There are three reasons. Ethnic issues. So if there is a part of the country that has a different ethnic identity, language, religion, or customs, a national government might be more likely to give more autonomy or independence to a different region. So that would be like the idea of ethno-nationalism, where a particular region sees themselves as distinct from the larger country. So if you look at England, England is where you will find London. London is where you will find the Parliament. Scotland is very. They do have a sense of ethno-nationalism. It means something to be a Scottish person, and they want to be able to make decisions for themselves. So London decided to go ahead and give Scotland power to have their own parliament and make some regional decisions on their own. However, you still have the presence of parliamentary sovereignty in the UK. The UK is always going to be supreme over the Scottish Parliament unless a Scottish referendum for independence were to pass. You have economic differences. There might be some inequalities in the standard of living in some places, and that these regions might feel like they're having to economically prop up the rest of the country, and they feel like they should be able to make some decisions on their own. Spatial forces. these places might be on the borders or on feel very geographically disconnected from the capital. You could say that Tibet, the area of Tibet, is a combination of ethnic and spatial forces, because the Tibetan people do have a different ethnic identity, well, in the regard that they believe in Tibetan Buddhism, and that area of China is not as economically developed. The GDP is lower, the purchasing power parity is lower in that part of China. So you might see that the people of Tibet want more power or autonomy of decision making in that region. So again, spatial forces, which would be like geographical, economic differences, and ethnic differences, would cause a unitary government to want to give some power to the regions to keep them kind of happy, and but still keep them a part of the overall country. Okay, now number 4, how is the evolution of power different than federalism? The thing is, in its federalism, your regional government's power is protected by the Constitution. So like in our country, our state's powers are protected by the 10th Amendment. In a unitary system, power can be taken away by the central government. So just as easily as they gave it, they could take it back. Okay, because subnational governments aren't protected by the Constitution, not like our states, again, are protected by the 10th Amendment. You might see in a unitary system asymmetrical devolution, which means that some states or some regions within the state will get more power than other regions. All right, and then like the Scottish Parliament, the regional governments in Northern Ireland, the UK Parliament can decide to dissolve those, whereas the United States government cannot just dissolve the power that's held in Richmond. Okay, that is it for the first video of topic 5, levels of government.